Hello and welcome to our webinar today on creating a data-driven culture for real business rewards. I'm Julia King. I'm a business and technology journalist and I'll be your moderator for today. Our speaker is Ishit Washwajani, who is the enterprise strategist at Amazon Web Services. Ishit is a former CTO at A&E Networks, where he oversaw a major transformation of the technology function, including moving to the cloud. He is with us today thanks to AWS. So as I said, our topic is data-driven culture, and creating or conversations about data-driven enterprises often focus on tools and technology advancements that make storing, processing, and analyzing data faster or cheaper. This is certainly important, but creating a data-driven culture across the enterprise is essential to long-term business success. The reality is that enterprises with a data-driven culture achieve significantly higher business results than those without that culture. For example, data-driven organizations are 23 times more likely to acquire new customers and 6 times more likely to retain customers than their non-data-driven counterparts, according to McKinsey Global Institute. Data-driven companies also are 19 times more likely to be profitable. Data-driven companies also are growing fast at an average rate of 30% annually, according to Forrester Research. As of this year, Forrester has predicted that data-driven enterprises will have taken $1.8 trillion in business annually from their less data-driven industry competitors. In today's webinar, you will learn the key elements of a data-driven organization and how you can begin to create a data-driven culture. You'll also gain insight on how to transform from a data-informed enterprise to a data-driven culture where everyone uses data all of the time to make decisions. What the optimal organizational support a data-driven enterprise and how to go about setting that up. How to scale a data-driven culture as your business grows. As I said, our speaker is Ishit Washwajani, the enterprise strategist at AWS. And Ishit, over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Really excited to be here and share some thoughts and learnings. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Julia said, as an enterprise strategist at AWS, I'm fortunate to have an opportunity to work with executives from some of the world's largest companies and help them with mental models and strategies to innovate and differentiate in this business. And as you can imagine, the topic of data and how to become a data-driven enterprise comes up very, very frequently. So one thing that we hear and something that is pretty well accepted is that data is an important asset of any company. But how is it different? Because companies have many different assets. We have people, IP, plant, equipment, factories, retail shop, know-how. Data is unlike a lot of these assets. Data is unique. Data is also famously compared with oil. And now I know that this comparison is primarily to show that data is a valuable asset. But data is different than oil and many such assets. A lot of other assets, the traditional assets that businesses had, they are fixed in supply. Data, on the other hand, is limitless. In fact, with more of world's population coming online, with more and more people getting connected, how customers interact with businesses, search, buy product and services, as that moves to digital, as more factories, more homes, more devices, cars, how we consume entertainment comes online, we are just producing massive amount of data. And so there's limitless supply of data available to us today. Data is also different compared to other assets because it is available to everyone for use. And the reason is you produce data as you go about serving your customers and executing your business strategy. It's just about making a choice whether you're going to put that data to use. One of the other ways that data is different is that when you're transacting other assets, you have to transfer the control of that asset in exchange of some value. With data, you can exchange value by just sharing data while retaining ownership of that data. It's somewhat like you can have your cake and eat it too. But the most fundamental way that data is different is that the more data that you use, the more data you create. So in some ways, it's a self-replenishing asset. Now, if we go back to the history, companies have always used data. And so let's talk about what has changed. But let's first take a look at how companies have used data in the past. So in the past, traditionally, data was mainly used to report on past performance, what had already happened. And this was mainly financial and operational data that very senior executives and leaders in the company looked at to assess the past performance of the company. That changed with interactive queries and dashboards, where we started to get an ability to monitor what was going on, not just look at what had already happened. Data also became much more accessible, but it was still in silos. So sales had sales data, marketing had marketing data, finance had finance data, and we created new roles called power users. These were people who understood the business, but also understood the data related to their vertical. The challenge, as I said, was the data was still in silos. What has fundamentally changed beyond just the massive amount of data that we have available now is that with cloud, for the first time, we have an ability to put that data to use and make that data available to everyone in the company and use AI and machine learning to drive greater outcome using all of our data. So we don't have to make a trade-off of what data to use, what data to discard, because we can put all of our data to use. And so that's the reason this is the time that we are talking about becoming a data-driven enterprise. It is not just about the growing volume of data, but it's about our ability to put that data to use. Now, one question that fortunately is not asked very often, because I think we are all convinced that becoming data-driven is a good thing. But before we go into how to become data-driven, it is still a good reminder to take a look at some of the reasons why becoming data-driven is important. So data obviously helps us make better decisions. But I would argue that what is more important is that data helps us make those better decisions faster. And speed matters in today's business. Data also helps us respond better to unexpected events. By spotting early trend, by experimenting, seeking quick feedback from the customers on whether our efforts are working or not, and then pivoting and changing the course. Because some of the events, like for example, global pandemic that we are in middle of, are impossible to predict. But data helps us make informed, better decisions when these kind of events happen. Data also helps us build deep understanding of our customers and then use those insights to create amazing customer experiences, which can then result into new opportunities, new products, new services, and new revenue lines. And do all of that while improving efficiency, taking out waste, automating, and making better decisions to do that in an efficient manner. Let me share an example of a company creating amazing customer experiences using data, and that's Formula One. If you have ever been to a Formula One race, or if you have even watched the Formula One on TV, it's just fascinating the amount of insights that go into quick decision making. Before I tell you about how Formula One uses data, I want to play a short, quick video clip. Let's take a look. Well, if you're keeping track, that was under 1.5 second pit stop. That's fascinating. How does Formula One do that? Well, data is the fuel for Formula One. They have sensors all around the cars. They also have sensors all around the track. And from these over 120 different sensors, they collect over 1.1 million data points every second during a typical race. Now, this data is real-time data coming from the racetrack and the car. What Formula One has done, though, is that they have combined this real-time data with over 69 years of historical data, and then build machine learning models using Amazon SageMaker to predict overtake probability when two drivers are battling it out and approaching a turn, or uh, providing pit strategy, bringing fans much closer to the action. And that is making sports much more enjoyable, much more accessible. Once again, let's take a look at how this looks in action. I'll play a very quick video clip once again. Regardless of who you are rooting for there, it's fascinating to see as these two drivers are battling it out as they approach the turn. Uh, in real time, the overtake probability is changing, and it's using all of this data based on what is happening on the track right now, but historically what has happened in a similar situation. So that's a fantastic example of using data to create amazing customer experience. Now, what is a data-driven enterprise? So we talk a lot about data, but it's really the action using that data and insight that's valuable. Because without action, having a lot of data is pretty useless. So a data-driven enterprise obviously has an ability to curate, store, and make available a vast variety of data. But they then build capabilities to convert this data into actionable insight. They don't stop there though. They have a culture which allows everyone to act on these insights because it's really those actions that drive the outcomes when it comes to becoming a data-driven enterprise. So how do you become a data-driven enterprise? We often hear some of these things. And this list is slightly tongue-in-cheek. Some of these are actually good ideas and they may help you become data-driven enterprise. But what is important is to not to look at this as sort of a series of checklist items because there is no magic wand. When it comes to becoming a data-driven enterprise, it starts with a data-driven culture. And culture is much beyond what is described values and missions of the company and how company is going to operate. It's beyond what is on the walls of the office and on the intranet. It's unstated behaviors and norms on how decisions are made, how information is shared across the whole company. This culture then has to be supported by a set of capabilities across your operating model, how you govern the data, how you structure and organize your teams, and what do you use to execute on this modern data strategy. Now, many companies get culture and capability right, but they get it right in a pocket. What the challenge is how do we scale this across the whole enterprise? And so in next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about how to create this data-driven culture at scale, and then how to create data-driven capabilities at scale. But let's start with culture first, because majority of the executives say that the biggest impediment to becoming a data-driven enterprise is culture. Only 5% of the challenges are technical in nature. And so getting the culture right is very, very important. And after going through my own journey and making several mistakes, I would distill this down to a framework that I call it 4E framework that I've used. So it starts with engage. How do you engage in data-driven decision-making and visible change when it comes to using data, starting all the way at the top? When it comes to driving this cultural change, executive sponsorship is not sufficient. It's important, but executives and very senior leaders of the company have to go beyond just sponsoring and approving the investment into this change. They have to make visible change into how they make decisions, how they communicate information. And then as leaders, we have to create mechanisms that allow this data-driven engagement to scale across the whole company. Let me share an example from Amazon. You may have heard that at Amazon, if we have a new product, new service, new idea, or we want to propose a change, we write what is called as 6-page narrative documents. What is important though is how we write them. So when we write these documents, we do not use some of these words. We don't use these adjectives. We call them weasel words. Instead, we use data and state facts to make our point. So instead of saying, by doing this, we will improve the performance significantly or create amazing customer experience, instead, we will say, by doing this, we'll reduce the page load time by 20% or reduce the shipping time by 1 day. Now, this may seem like a very small change, but this is a scaling mechanism that allows different businesses across Amazon to consistently make data-driven decisions, especially when they're thinking about new ideas. So that's first E. The second is enable. And it comes down to enabling frontline action using data. We often hear about democratizing access to data. But what is more important is, are we democratizing decisions and actions using that data? So instead of moving data up to where the decision makers are, it's about empowering and encouraging and enabling actions by the frontline employees and everyone in the company. And that again requires tremendous amount of change in the culture. It's about moving away from HIPPO-based decision making. And if you're not familiar with the term HIPPO here, it stands for highest paid person's opinion, to truly empowering employees at all levels. One fantastic example of this is massively popular game Fortnite. If you're a gamer, or if you have somebody in your family who's a gamer, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Fortnite. But it's a massively popular game by Epic Games, played by over 250 million gamers around the world. But it's a free-to-play game. And that means retaining and maintaining a very high level of engagement from their customers is pretty critical to Epic Games. And so what Epic Games does is they collect petabytes of data around weapons, game strategy, the playtime, as multiple millions of gamers are playing the game. But they don't stop there. They then make this data available in real time and enable game designers to make changes in the game based on what they are seeing. So they can suddenly introduce new weapons, change the map layout, or put new content up to increase the engagement of the gamers. So that's an example of not only collecting massive amount of data, but then enabling action using that data on the front line. The third is educate. We hear about data literacy quite a lot. I prefer the term data proficiency because it implies a higher level of skill. It's very important to treat data as a core skill for the entire company, not just with people with data or analytics in their title. And this means finding fun and engaging ways to drive the education and awareness. It also means continuous education in terms of creating a common language and vocabulary. How often do we see that companies and departments don't even agree on a definition of what the customer is, what a contract is, what a year is? And so it's critical to identify some of these elements and drive continuous education and common vocabulary across the whole company. We see many companies host data hackathons where they bring cross-functional teams together, pair them with data scientists and analysts, give them fun data sets from their everyday lives like census data, traffic ticket violations, restaurant bookings, and ask them to solve fun challenges. The idea here is to make data accessible and within the reach of everyone. Build that education, build that excitement, and translate that into the outcome for the business. The fourth, and in my mind, the most important, is eliminate. We talk about data being in silos, of different system silos, different application silos. But what is more important to overcome are the cultural and departmental silos that are guarding these data silos. And that means focusing on change management, even focusing on how your org is structured. Is your org designed to protect these data silos? And how do you reimagine the structure which enables more access to the data? It's also about eliminating old ways of doing things when you move to building data-driven products and data-driven solutions. We often see because of the fear of change, companies keep old systems, old reporting engines, old way of doing things around. It's very important when you drive the change to eliminate the option of going back. And the example that I want to share is from A&E Networks, where I was fortunate to be the global CTO. Now, A&E is in the business of telling stories. And so content is at the heart of what A&E does. But as we all know, how we consume content as consumers is changing. And that means it was becoming harder to understand who the customer was. It wasn't just someone who was sitting in front of a TV set at a specific time. How we were making money because our revenue sources were diversifying. What did we have in the basket or inventory to sell? Because we were no longer just producing one type of shows, but many different type of content that we were trying to monetize. And getting answers to these questions was difficult because data was sitting in a lot of silos. And once again, these were not just system silos. These were also functional silos that were guarding these system silos. And so to overcome that, we made a commitment all the way from our CEO and the executive team to drive the change to become a more data-driven culture. That meant we focused on setting the stage to make more data accessible, break down these walls by building a platform called Show Me on AWS to provide deeper, wider access to data. We aligned the company around 12 different KPIs so that everyone across the function was talking the same language and going after the same outcome. To build excitement and make data more accessible, we built Alexa skills and called it Tell Me, which was a play on the Show Me platform, and put Alexa speakers in offices so people can interact with data. They can ask questions to data. That made data much more within the reach for everyone to use. And so to create and scale a data-driven culture comes down to driving engagement, starting at the top, enabling frontline action for everyday decisions, not just big decisions, investing in and focusing on education where data is treated as a core skill for the whole company, and then focus change management effort to eliminate silos, making data enjoyable to use, not just easy to use. What I would love to do at this point is hear from you as to what is the biggest impediment that you face in your company in becoming a data-driven enterprise. So a quick poll is going to launch. It's just one question. Is the biggest impediment in your organization lack of executive buy-in or support, outdated governance model? Is it because you have different silos that I talked about, lack of data, or technical debt? Please pick an option that best describes. Would love to hear your thoughts, and then happy to take the questions in the Q&A as well around this. So let's take maybe 10 seconds to answer this question, and let's take a look at what the results are. There it is. All right, 51%, more than half of you say that it's the organizational silos. And that's totally in line with what we hear from working with many customers as well. The second is outdated governance model, which is a big issue because it's a tension between making more data available versus sort of maintaining the tight governance and then executive support. Awesome, great, this is great. And this is a great segue into what I'm going to talk about next in terms of building data capabilities, which includes governance. So we talked about how to create a data-driven culture, but this culture has to be supported by a set of capabilities on how you organize and structure, how you govern, and how you execute. Let's start with organization structure. One of the patterns that we see is that many companies are centralizing data and analytics. Now, centralization may be a good idea if it is a community to solve problems and make everybody become better at using data. But if centralization is driven to assert control and make sure that all requests are now funneled through one team, that typically slows down the progress. It's also important to consider the role of IT and technology, because IT has an end-to-end view of how transactions are happening across your business, how your customers are served. And so regardless of how organizationally your data team is structured, involving IT as a stakeholder is a critical point of your organizational design. And then the final piece is treating data as a product, not a byproduct of some application or product initiative that you're trying to go for. And there are many models that we see companies adopt, but one of the models that is increasingly getting popular is a data marketplace model, where responsibilities are pushed down to the edges. So the producer of data, sort of the domain experts who understand their data really well, they are responsible for data ownership, data management, deciding who gets access to this data, and then publishing that data that is curated and validated for everyone to use in a central marketplace. The central marketplace team manages this platform where it becomes easier for producers to publish the data. They provide security controls, an ability to onboard data sets, and then consumers of data. Those who want to build an analytical model, maybe machine learning, they are able to search this data marketplace, find examples, how to use data sets, combine different data sets for their use and build those models. This is one of the structures that we see getting a lot of traction because it increases agility and pushes responsibility down to where the expertise lies. And that brings us to the point around governance capabilities. And that some of you said that there was the second biggest impediment beyond organizational silos. When it comes to governance, I believe that it is very important to start with guiding principles and tenets before you go into policies and procedures. And what I mean by that is a simple decision or a simple tenet that says we're going to govern to enable more access to data in a safe and compliant manner rather than restrict it. Now, it may sound like a simple goal, but setting that as a guiding principle can inform everything that you do down the line. Investing in data catalog and data lineage as well as traceability is also critical because security, compliance regulations, privacy requirements are going to continue to evolve and change around the world. And so building and investing into that strong data lineage will help you respond better instead of coming in at the end to think of security and privacy as an afterthought. Following some of the best practices like encrypting all of the data, whether it is at rest, whether it is in transit, are some of the ways that we can ease the governance in a safe and compliant manner while providing more access to data. That brings us to the third capability and how you execute and how you build. Because a great strategy with poor execution leads you nowhere. And so it's important to start with customer or business backward rather than data forward. So it's not about, well, let's bring all the data and figure out what we are going to do. But instead, find a problem, build out a strong hypothesis, and work backward from there by bringing relevant data, running some analytics, iterating, taking action on that. It's also important to focus on capturing data, not just consuming data. There's a saying that data ages like a wine and applications like fish. And so we often don't have modernization strategy behind our application and product to capture right data set. And then the final piece when it comes to execution is using the right tool for the right job, breaking free of standardization and one size fits all approach for wrong reason. And so that comes down to execution. Now, one example that brings a lot of what I talked about together is the car rental company EVS. EVS wanted to improve the rental experience, but also wanted to improve how they were utilizing their fleet and improve efficiency through better management of their fleet. Now, these may sound like hard to balance and conflicting goals. And EVS had a ton of data from external systems, their car fleet, their internal system, but very limited insight. So what they decided to do was they did a field pilot at Newark Airport in New Jersey, where they had people observe the rental process and list out the key attributes that were going in both from the rental agent as well as customers in making decisions about renting a vehicle. They then used this data set to build a machine learning model. They optimized, tested just at that airport location, found that they needed to collect some other attributes and refine this model. And now that has been integrated as part of their mobile app itself in the rental experience, providing them both better customer experience, but also improving operational efficiency. So that's a great example of starting small, but picking an impactful business area, building a hypothesis, collecting some data, and then incrementally iterating on achieving the outcomes. So we have talked about how to create and scale the data-driven culture with the 4E model, and then how to support that culture with capabilities across organization, governance, and execution, how to incrementally and iteratively build this. There are a number of resources available from AWS as well as enterprise strategy team in AWS for continuing the dialogue as well as learning more and diving deeper and engaging with us. Would love to stay connected and answer any questions that you may have. Looking forward to answering any questions that have come up during the session in the Q&A. Thank you for your time and listening into this. Back to you, Julia, for our Q&A.
Ishit, thank you so much for an informative presentation. It was just terrific, and we have lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to go directly there. And our first question has to do with how people interpret data. And of course, different people interpret data differently based on their experience, based on their history. How do you ensure that everyone is interpreting data the same way?
Yeah, great question, Julia. And one of the things that I've seen work, number one, as I talked about, on the foundational element of data, gain consensus on definition of those foundational elements. And they don't have to be a list of 100 different things, right? They can be 10, 15 things that truly matter to your business and the company. How do we define customer? How do we define some of the critical transactions that are happening in your business, right? So get an alignment of that. That is number one. Number two is it's important especially when it comes to interpreting data, to have diversity of voices at the table, especially in the global business, in a way that we are serving our consumers around the world. It's very important, especially when you're making decisions using data, that your data set as well as people using the data set reflect the communities and customers that you're working in. So I think it's two-way thing. One is driving education where you're aligning on few common definitions, but then making sure that you have diversity of voices represented in helping you define and arrive at interpretation of this data that reflects the customer and the community that you work in.
Well, our next question is one that I think will resonate widely. How can you get executives to make decisions when they see the data is different from their expectations or their gut feelings?
Yeah, look, I think I somewhere talked about in the presentation that there is typically a tendency to use data to justify what has already been decided upon, or tell a story that in some ways supports the narrative that we want to build. And it requires tremendous amount of effort, education, excitement. I think number one is it has to be driven from very senior leadership. This change will only scale if very senior executives are committed to driving it. And it's about a couple of things. It's about tying and making it a safe place where if data is telling you to do something different, or data is identifying a mistake, a missed opportunity, or a pattern that was missed, that's okay. So it's about creating a culture where failure and changing your mind based on information and data is celebrated. It's not just accepted and tolerated, but it's actually celebrated. And that starts with leading from front, right? That starts with executives actually visibly saying, hey, look, I thought this was true, but when I looked at this information or I looked at customer data or feedback, it turned out to be something different, and I'm actually changing my mind to go and do something different. I think that sends a very powerful message to the employees to do that. The second part of that is uh, tie with the outcomes for the business as well as the individual and the function, right? To make it easier, how is data going to help you be better at what you do every single day? And so it's about not just telling the story of how much data we have, but how is that data going to help you, whether you are a accountant, whether you are a finance person, whether you are a developer, engineer, product manager. It's about tying those outcomes back to the success of the individual and the function that they are responsible for.
Well, I'll flip this question around a little bit with this next question. If you're working with a traditional C-level suite on a new data-driven program, what's the most important them in order to achieve their buy-in?
Julia, I lost you there for a second. Uh, what is most important to them? Was that the question?
What's the most important message to send to the C-suite to achieve their buy-in if you're working on a new data-driven program?
Yeah, I think two things. This is not, in some ways, look, there's a sense of urgency that we need to drive with the C-suite. And if we are thinking about not only growing the business, but even surviving in today's era of rapid change, if we don't act, somebody else will. Because customers, whoever our customers are, regardless of the industry, are expecting things to be different, especially in the world of digital transformation. So I think driving the sense of urgency that this is really not an option. It's a path that we need to take, and the cost of not doing it can result into bigger problems, bigger challenges. So that is one. The second is appealing to the sense of possibilities, sharing successes and examples of other companies that have taken the path from your peer groups. So look at others who have walked on this path, have seen some success, share their examples as to why they have been successful, how they have been successful. The third part is it's arming executives and C-suite with insights that are clear that the human intelligence in decision making has a very, very important roles to play. And as leaders, they are the ones who can drive this change. And so it is not about replacing the years of business experience and business acumen. It's about really supercharging it and enhancing it to make better decisions. So I think those are the few things. And then showing early wins, right? Showing and building that momentum through experimentation where you're starting something small, harvesting the value, and then using that story to build the flywheel and momentum.
Here's a question about the data itself. How do you get, or how have you gotten over bad legacy data?
Good question. Look, reality of many companies is that they're not starting from scratch, right? They have a 15, 20, 30, sometimes 100 years worth of business data and transactions that are in place. The approach that I have taken there, and again, there could be many options. I'll share what has worked for me. Is that often when we look at overwhelming amount of legacy data that is being sitting in there, um, it can be very hard to figure out how do you even get started. And so what I think about is working backward from the problem you're trying to solve. And so as I talked about, don't start data forward, but start the outcome or the customer in the business backward. And so if you're trying to solve for creating better customer experience, if you're trying to solve for increasing revenue, if you're trying to solve for reducing cycle time, eliminating defects in manufacturing process, whatever the problem is, work backward from there to put a ring fence around what do you need to get started on just that. So while I may have ton of legacy data that may be holding me back, but can I get started with something to impact on these one or two really visible changes that I'm trying to drive, and then work backward from there. Um, so instead of thinking about sort of migrations and conversion of data as this massive effort to move from A to B, you start to think about, well, if I to make this decision, maybe last 5 years data is what gets used more often than what happened 15 years back. Could I actually start there? Could I actually just bring that in, work on improving the quality, fixing and learning, and then continue to build my strategy around bringing rest of the data? Sometimes you also have to make hard decisions in terms of um, discarding some of the data that because it is not just not a fit in terms of the modern architecture, it may just not be good quality data because you did not have the right mechanism on how the data was captured. So I would say see from the lens of the value that that data is returning. And cloud provides amazing ways to archive rest of the data, right? So if you needed to go back to it, you could.
Here's a question about organizational structure. Should data scientists sit in the business teams or with IT? What are the pros and cons of each arrangement?
Yeah, this is one of those questions where I think it really depends on the context of the org. I have seen in my work with working with many companies around the world, both the models. I do so. I would say the closer to the customer and the business, the better, right? And this is not just true for data scientists. I would say every function in the organization, we need to shrink the distance between the work they do and how it impacts customer continuously, right? That's the only way to get the agility and get quick feedback. When data scientists sit in the business units, the advantage of that are obvious, right? They can build deep insights, relationship, and understanding of that function. So if they are in marketing, they can deeply build relationship as well as the mental models that can be applied to marketing, bring strong affinity or build strong affinity to the problems, and then use that to solve data challenges. Um, this model typically works when the business units have the maturity to build this skill set in-house. It is also a model that works when the data sets and the type of problems that different business units are trying to solve are pretty heterogeneous, right? So there is wide disparity or completely different business segment areas that they play in, where having data scientists embedded with individual line of businesses could be a better approach. But we also see often companies where they are still working on that maturity, where centralizing data science function, because most of the data is homogeneous in nature, the skill set that are in line of business is not yet mature enough. In that case, centralizing that with IT to gain some early wins and momentum could be a better idea. Regardless of where organizationally it sits, it's about how do you break down the communication barriers and silos on the problems that they're trying to solve.
Well, not surprisingly, based on the polling results, we've had a lot of questions about breaking down silos. And to get started, what are some of the best ways to do it? How do you know you're going in the right direction?
Yeah, it's something that I was not surprised to see the results there. That over half of our respondents said that organizational silos is the biggest challenge. Few things I shared. Once again, it does require commitment from the executive leadership, because these silos have been built over a number of years. The second thing is you have to understand the motivation behind this resistance, right? As to why these silos are guarding it. Sometimes there is a good reason. Sometimes it's driven from the fact that uh, these silos or these functions want to make sure that when people use their data set, they know what they're doing with it, and they are using the right quality validated data sets, or they're afraid that they may make decisions based on data that they don't understand fully. So understanding those motivation is very important, because that will help you design a different approach to solve for it. If the motivation is that, what I just described, then one of the approaches, how do you partner with those leaders who are data experts, understand their silos data really well, and make them into the educators and steward who, instead of making decision on whether Julia should have access to this data set or Ishit should have access to this data set, are actually in charge of making sure that you and I are trained on how to use that data set well. We have a place to go to if we have questions. And so understanding the motivation is critical. Second part that I talked about is how do you make data enjoyable to use, not just easy to use? And what that means is find creative ways to make data much more accessible. That will help break down silos, because there will be a groundswell of demand that will come, which will overwhelm some of these walls that have been created over a number of years. And then the third piece is, it's like any other change management effort. You have to sometimes make some harder decisions. If it is about if the organization structure is standing in the way, you may want to restructure the team. If it is about communication, it comes down to conveying the benefit to the larger enterprise about this. It may come down to changing your incentive structure, where everyone is aligned around a common outcome rather than the success within that silo, right? So we may be hitting our sales target, but if our profitability is not improving, well, then how do we align those incentives that forces these functions to work together?
We have two questions on education here, and they seem to tie back to the silo question. Is training overrated or outdated? And what are the best practices to improve data proficiency as opposed to data literacy? Can you handle the education element internally, or is it better to outsource it? So that's a lot of questions there packed into one.
Yeah, I think I don't believe training is overrated. But I also think that training has to go beyond certification on tools and technology and few things, right? So training has to sort of be more about learning, and that is where you may have roles that are required to build technical skills, and you train them in traditional training methods. But you may also have roles where creating learning paths to enhance the ability to use data. Example that I gave, right, where people use fun ways, data hackathons to solve everyday problem. Not just necessarily throw business data on you, but really say, hey, you know what, let's solve things that you can relate to in your everyday life. Traffic, parking, census data, restaurant booking, movie and entertainment bookings, things like that, right? Because that makes data much more accessible. Training or education is also not a one and done thing. And so it's also about building that as a practice and a muscle that continues that thing as part of onboarding new people. As technology changes, as how we use data changes, as your own organization's culture changes on how data is used. It's an ongoing effort to invest into education. Executive education is another part that should not be ignored. So often when we talk about training, it's about leaders saying, well, let's train everybody else. It's also about raising the awareness within the C-suite itself. And so in those things, relying and partnering with external providers, your partners that you work with, other institutions, relying on resources like MIT, those are all great ideas to bring that continuous education. I think we can learn from everywhere.
Well, we have time for one more question here, and maybe a tweet-sized answer. You can answer this one, which has to do with what recommendations you might have for setting up a pilot program or a pilot project on data-driven culture so that scaling becomes easier.
Yeah, great question. I would say, and the a tweet-sized answer would be find something that is hashtag impactful, hashtag visible, hashtag relatable, and then build a hypothesis, start incrementally building analytics to drive the change, bring the team, and then tell that story as much as you can. Go and communicate. But the impactful, visible, and relatable problem is something that is critical because that will help you drive and scale this change at scale because people will get behind the success. So I think that would be my my take on that.
Well, Ishit, thank you so much. This has been such an informative session, and thank you to our audience for their attention and their great questions. A final thank you to our sponsor, AWS. This is a timely and important topic, and we appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, everyone.